The night the city went out, the darkness rose like a tide from the subway grates. It didn't fall from the sky. It climbed, smooth and slow and without apology, sliding over curbs, washing into basements, slipping like velvet into the narrow folds between strangers on the sidewalks. Phones blinked dead. Elevators paused mid-sigh. Somewhere, a violin stuttered to a halt in a studio that suddenly remembered it had windows. The sky above, relieved of competition, offered a shallow bowl of tired stars. It wasn't an angry blackout. It was the kind that felt deliberate, as if the city had been asked a question and, for once, decided to answer honestly by saying nothing at all. Mara Ilyin was halfway across the archival floor when the fluorescence died. Their hum had been her company long after colleagues left for brighter lives. She stood still as tiny afterimages crawled across her vision. Bars, grids, the negative of a room she knew by heart. The blackout swallowed the stacks, the microfilm readers, the glassed-in cubicle where someone had left a mug with a chipped lip and a sticky ring of tea warming no one. "Okay," she said aloud to the dark. "All right." Her voice sounded good in there. Round. Honest. The kind of voice that Lint remembered. She fished a small flashlight from her tote and thumbed it on. A firm, coin-sized circle of light fell obediently onto the floor and then climbed the nearest shelf, revealing labels in her tidy hand. Railway, 1921 to 1935. Zoning, 1970s. Telephony, MISC. The beam shivered when she did. She steadied it against the shelf and breathed until the breath was shaped like patience. Blackouts were not unheard of. The building was old. The wires in the walls were academic in their understanding of work, theoretical. But the street outside was a mercury stream of perpetual light, billboards, traffic, the never-say-die of the city that sold wakefulness like candy. For that to go dark? That was story-shaped. Mara had loved stories long before she admitted to loving anything else. She worked in the Hall of Records not because she believed in the righteousness of history, but because she liked its texture. Dust soft as guilt, ink stamped with what felt like certainty, boxes that were a kind of prayer. She had steadied herself, through grief, through a divorce she'd folded like paper and slipped inside a book, by trusting that someone had written it down. Even if they wrote it badly, they had tried. Trying deserved a place to live. She crossed the floor toward the window fanning out over 13th Avenue. The city below was a topography of absence. In that absence, she could hear things, the elevator cables relaxing, the distant argue of a siren, the faint, argumentative chorus of crickets that had been waiting to audition for years. Mara pressed her palm to the glass, as if touch could confer understanding. The glass was warm. That was wrong. The air had cooled with the night. The blackout had relieved the vents of their hot breath. Yet the window held a fever as if the day were trapped inside it, still sweating. She withdrew her hand. After an instant, a pale, oily print lifted in the darkness, her palm glowing as if it had been sketched with foxfire. She blinked. The handprint hung there not on the glass, but just in front of it, a thin lamp of her, fingers and lines preserved in a faint, opalescent sheen. The glow should have died. It did not. It lingered, a smolder of not quite. "Phosphor?" she whispered, then shook her head. There was no coating on that old glass. She would know. She had catalogued the windows herself when the building applied for heritage status. This was a different sort of persistence. She waited. The handprint drifted like a jellyfish, puffing outward, thinning and spreading, an aurora the size of her hand. Within the wash, something moved. Not a reflection. There was nothing bright enough to reflect. Not a shadow. There was nothing brighter behind it to cast one. It was motion born from the glow itself, a distortion like breath on a winter day, gathering into a line, a shoulder, the curve of hair behind an ear. It was a figure seen through the memory of light, as if the room had decided to continue a moment after moments were meant to end. Mara stepped back because she is the sort of person who steps back, who inventories before she reaches. The figure in the glow did not step at all. It stood with a habitual tilt and then raised its head like someone listening for shoes in a hallway. A woman, Mara thought. Short hair. a coat that hung too heavy to be summer. The glow collected along the coat's seams and the rims of her ears, not quite finding her eyes. When the woman turned, the light fell into a familiar shape, a profile that was not Mara's but had lived in Mara's house once, laughed in Mara's kitchen, folded paper cranes, and left them tucked into the bookshelves like molting birds. The glow woman was someone else. And yet the angle of her jaw was close enough to ache. "Mom," Mara said. But the syllable was more reflex than hope. The glow shivered, and then, though the window was closed, though there was no air moving, the afterlight breathed. The breath lifted a strand of Mara's hair. It tasted like old film, dust and lemon oil and the sweetly burnt smell of a projector at the end of a school day. A whisper, too faint to be language, seeded the air and fell like white noise against her skin. Her flashlight guttered and died, as if someone had pinched it. The dark had a personality then, curious but polite. Mara reached for the battery compartment and didn't open it. Instead, she let the dark lean. "What do you want to show me?" she asked. The afterlight brightened, just a notch, and then it did something Mara later would learn to dread and to seek. It replayed. Not a full scene. Not a clean recording. Just motion and residue, and the soft edges of intention. The glow woman lifted her hand toward the window as if to touch, as if to check whether the night outside was made of water. Her sleeve shifted. On her wrist, a bracelet made of storm thread caught the light that wasn't there. She turned away, looking not at Mara but across the room toward the archival desks where a lamp would normally sit. She put both hands flat on the surface, hands like Mara's but not, and leaned until the edge pressed a shallow line into her palms. She was bracing herself. The whisper grew teeth. Words arrived out of order, like index cards spilled on a floor. "Don't," said one. "Meant," said another. "Not yet," said a third, more insistent, edged with impatience. Mara knew the trick of not interfering. The archives taught that. A record is a record. You hold it. You describe it. You do not teach it its lines. But her hands itched to reach into the light, to press them over those glowing hands and say, "What? I'm here." Or "You made mistakes, but you were still my beginning." Or "Nothing at all." A clink in the stairwell broke the spell, as all cities try to break spells with practical noises. The glow thinned like breath on a mirror. The figure loosened into smear, and then into a paler smudge, and finally into a barely decorous hint of luminescence that could be memory or wish. The window cooled. The dark held again. Mara stood unmoving until the chair legs in the reading room finished their subtle, settling shuffles. She pressed her thumb into the sticky circle on her palm where fear had sweat and then dried. She felt, not for the first time, the shape of a decision perched like a bird on the railing of her life, looking at her sideways. She had promised herself not to believe, not to get drunk on meaning, not to chase ghosts because grief was bored and wanted sport. But she also had keys to cupboards that nobody else remembered. She crossed back through the stacks by memory, counting shelves, brushing fingers at knee height to catch the familiar roughness of a patched panel, the nick where a dolly had misbehaved. In a back room, once a coal room, then a mechanical room, now a cave of equipment too legacy, to sell and too beloved to throw away, she found the row of wooden cabinets with brass handles, each with a card frame neatly labeled by her own handwriting as if she'd been preparing for this night. Plates, glass negative, damage. She opened a drawer. The smell of old time came out like a kept promise. Tin, vinegar, a damp note that was really the memory of damp. Glass negatives lay in paper sleeves, each sleeve annotated with legible thoughts from the early 20th century. Mara Ilyin, sick, read one by coincidence, a misspelling but a sign that the past meant to be intimate. No, she told herself sternly, no meanings yet. She sorted down until she found a set of plates that had failed catastrophically in a flood in 1963, their emulsions gouged and blistered, their images half gone, unusable, unexhibitable, beloved by nobody. She took one in both hands and brought it upstairs. The city outside still slept wrong. The blackout composed the streets into long, unblinking sentences. In the reading room, Mara set the plate on the desk by the window and sat facing it. She did not turn on the emergency lamp beside her. She did not check her phone. She did not call the utility company like a citizen. She just watched the glass in the dark. At first, nothing behaves. Then the plate breathed in. It took an hour to do it, or a second. Time lost traction under the noiseless weight of waiting. The glass grew not brighter, but more specific. The negative's damaged emulsion found its way into the present tense. Cracks became coastlines. Bubbles became lunar craters. The plate had been ruined 40 years before Mara was born. Tonight, ruin became a map. Where the emulsion had peeled back, a rectangle of pure transparency formed a window into the room itself. The window-in plate showed the reading desk's scarred wood, the faint residue of polish, a paperclip that had migrated and been left like a sedated fish. Then the window-in plate did a thing windows do not. It drifted a finger's width to the left. Mara leaned in, paper-thin quiet pressing on her ears. The glass brightened, just barely, not to light the room, but to sharpen it. Inside the plate, a ghost room stacked itself atop the real one, bent by the optics of regret. A chair existed in the plate that did not exist in the room. In that chair sat a man with his head in his hands. She did not recognize the man. She recognized the posture. Anyone who has ever misplaced a word knows that posture. Anyone who has ever lost a person knows the chair. He lifted his head. His hair was the elaborate failure of someone who had tried to look informal for a meeting. He wore a suit jacket whose stitches had almost learned to shrug. A membership card was clipped to his lapel on a lanyard. City Hall, Archives, temporary. There was no name. The name had peeled. He rubbed his eyes with his knuckles, then reached for a small lamp, the kind with a metal hood and a switch like a tiny guillotine. He flicked it on. The room did not brighten. The plate did. The lamp's light hit the plate, as if it had been hungry for it all this time. It saturated the emulsion, skimmed the gouges, pooled in the lunar dips, and then overflowed, slow, honey-thick, into the place where images would be, if they could be. In that overflow was sound. The sound was not the man's voice, but what the lamp would have heard if lamps could listen. "Not asking you," said the light, in a tone that taught the word plead to stand upright. "Protocol," another voice, clipped and official, paper cutting paper. "No, I know," the man said, and here, like a river pressed through a culvert, the words came clear enough that Mara could taste the shape of them in her mouth. "Just one night, and then I'll file it and forget." "That's not how forgetting," said the other voice, stern as a rule. The light had remembered this much, and no more. It had rearranged what it had caught, the way a child stacks blocks into a shape the builder never intended, but which is structurally inevitable because the blocks are what they are. The man bowed his head, and his hands opened on the desk with that precise honesty people have when they aren't performing for anyone. Inside his left palm was a crescent scar. He turned his hands over, and the scar became the bright end of an unfinished sentence. Mara felt herself lean nearer as if the plate were aflame, and she an old moth with careful wings. The man reached beneath the desk, tugged out a drawer, and removed a cloth-wrapped bundle. He unrolled it with reverence. Inside was a bracelet made of storm thread, the same one the glowwoman had worn. It was impossible to be sure, except that this is how impossibilities begin, with a detail too precise for coincidence and too small for design. The bracelet remembered wrists. Even in the half-made light, it had the shape of an embrace. "Not yours to keep," the paper voice insisted. "Then I'll keep it until morning," the man said, and lifted the bracelet as if it were fragile and feral both. He held it near the lamp so that the light could learn its edges. "Just until morning." He pressed his thumbnail to the clasp. Something inside the plate gave way like ice shifting on a river. The glow thickened, the man and his chair, and the lamp swam. The bracelet's curve flashed, a fish turning, and then the light in the plate did something Mara had no word for. It filed itself. It took itself from itself and placed the copy in a long corridor of illumination somewhere beyond the plate, beyond the room, beyond the city, where stories go when their tellers forget. For an instant Mara felt that corridor the way a room feels a draft, the pressure of a long, well-lit place full of shelves and steps and whispers of later. Then the glass went humble again. It was only a ruined negative, opaque in all the wrong places, clear where it should not be. Outside, the siren gave up on whichever emergency it had been failing to reach. Mara sat back and felt the city find her spine. Her mother had owned a bracelet, yes. But not that one. Or maybe exactly that one. Memory is a forgery that obeys the laws of physics less than it obeys the laws of need. She closed her eyes until tiny gold flakes drifted in the dark like snow seen in lamplight, the residue of the fluorescence, the afterimage of the plate. When she opened them, the room was itself again. On the desk, something had changed. The paperclip lay a fraction of an inch nearer to the plate than it had been. A small, stupid change, but the kind of wrong that rearranges a person. Mara slid it back to where it should be. Then she stood and turned toward the door, because the practical act of leaving is a spell breaker, and she needed a broken spell before she did anything silly, like believe. In the corridor, the emergency lights had come on, thin red sticks of glow above the exits, arrows reminding everyone their bodies had a way out. Their light was not comforting. It was bureaucratic. Mara moved under it and felt, as you might feel a bass note in your ribs, a low humming in the air that hummed not at any particular pitch, but at the concept of persistence. The lights were telling the building what to do next. Remain. At the stairwell, footsteps came up like punctuation, comma, 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 a pause at each landing. A figure emerged, holding his phone like a torch that had gotten a degree in cartography. "Hi," he said to Mara, blinking as if surprised that the stairwell contained a person as well as stairs.
"So,
Is it just me, or is the dark performing?" His hair had the elaborate failure of someone who'd tried to tame it with tap water and a hope. He wore a messenger bag at a tilt, and a shirt that said Lantern Cartography as if that were a company or a dare. "You're not supposed to be up here," Mara said, because rules are what we say when the world is suddenly too large. "The reading rooms are closed." "Yeah," he said easily. "But the city is open. And the city is, hang on." He cupped his hand around his ear with theatrical sincerity and listened. "The city is humming?" Mara did not smile.
she wanted to.
He smiled enough for both of them, dimly, like a polite candle. "I'm Evo," he said. "Maps. Freelance. I made a thing." He held up his phone. An app glowed with a map of the city smudged by blinking dots. People are dropping outage pins, and the pins are migrating. They're clustering in a way that, okay, if I tell you it looks like a constellation, you're going to roll your eyes. But it looks like a constellation. Except it moves. "Blackouts cluster where the grid is weak," Mara said. "There are papers." "Sure," Evo said. "But grids don't usually make a new shape every 20 minutes. Unless the grid has taste." He squinted down over the banister at the dark below, then up at the red-armed emergency light with a cautious affection. "I think the city is drawing something. And, sorry, but I think your building is one of the bright points." Mara pictured the plate on the desk, still and unassuming, and the corridor of light beyond the world where someone else's bracelet was being filed under from a desk lamp, 11:13 p.m. A part of her, a thin, strong wire, wanted to tell Evo to leave, to let her have this alone so that if it turned out to be nothing, she could own the nothing cleanly. Another part, the part that had learned patience and kindness from the act of labeling, understood that stories, like cities, do better with witnesses. "Show me," she said. He grinned like a lamp that had just remembered electricity. "There's a substation a few blocks over. It's a hot spot on the map. Well, a dark spot, I guess, but the pins gather and then scatter like schooling fish. If we go now, we beat the hipster ghost hunters by 20 minutes. She studied him. He had the look of someone who gets lost on purpose in order to find the thing that would have been too shy to appear if sought directly. Useful in a cartographer. Dangerous in a person. "Give me 2 minutes," she said. 2 minutes in the archives is a lie. It will always be 12. Mara moved. She slipped the ruined plate into a padded envelope and marked it with a code that would argue, convincingly, that she had returned it to storage. She tucked the envelope into her tote beside the flashlight that wouldn't, and a notebook with a broken elastic. She locked the reading room and, without thinking, touched the window once with the back of her knuckles. The glass was properly cool. The afterglow did not answer.
Good.
Then she followed Ivo down the stairs. On the street, the dark had gotten comfortable. It had found its posture and its jokes. People stood in clusters, laughing too loudly at their own silhouettes. Someone buskied with a harmonica that had learned loneliness during the pandemic and never unlearned it. Far away, a transformer popped like a camera. The air smelled faintly of ozone and summer fruit bruised on the bottom of a grocery bag. Ivo set a brisk pace that would have annoyed her if she weren't humming inside to match him. He kept glancing at his phone and then at the sky, and then at the phone again, as if making sure they still agreed about where the horizon was. "Look," he said, tilting the screen toward her. The map's pins drifted inexorably toward a ragged diamond shape that sat like a small, embarrassed crown in the grid. "The substation," he said. "Diamond Street." The streets were velvet. Windows glowed with candlelight, with the occasional battery-powered lantern. In one window, a cat sat like a punctuation mark in the sentence of a curtain and watched Mara as if she were an edit. It felt like walking inside a photograph from the 1970s that had not decided whether to be warm or cool. At Diamond Street, a low building crouched behind a chain-link fence strung with signs that warned in 5 languages against humor. The fence had new dents. People had tested its resolve. Ivo stood with his hands in his pockets and rocked on his heels, thinking. "I want to be responsible," he murmured. "I also want to be near the thing that is happening." "Both can be true," Mara said, surprising herself. "We can watch." They watched. The substation didn't glow. It cohered. It acquired specificity the way the plate had, as if someone were turning the saturation knob, not on color, but on presence. The transformer stacks became less background, more nouns. The air above them flocked with a glitter too fine to be moisture and too ordered to be dust. That glitter drifted toward them and then, with exquisite manners, stopped at the fence and settled along its diamond pattern until the fence was a ledger of light. "Do you see it?" Ivo whispered. "Yes," Mara said. Her voice had become a tool. The light did not shine. It edited. Where it lay on the fence, the world behind it simplified, less noise, more signal. Through each diamond of possession, the substation, the sky, the city rendered in clean lines like a blueprint that remembered its original intention. Shapes within shapes. The fence was a grid, and the grid was a net, and the net was a throat, and the throat was saying a word Mara didn't yet know. "Hold this," Ivo said, handing her his phone. His hand brushed hers, and his skin felt like a statistic wrapped in happening. He dug in his bag and produced a small handheld spectrometer, because apparently he was that sort of person. He aimed it at the fence and squinted. "It's not any wavelength I have a file for." "Which means what?" "That my files are incomplete," he said cheerfully. "Or that light has started doing nouns." The pins on his map clustered so tightly they made a single bloated star, and then, like a jellyfish seen from above, pulsed outward in 4 threads along 4 streets. The threads slid beneath their feet like cats, clever and amused by their own secrecy. Across the street, a small boy with a juice box lifted his straw toward the fence and whispered, "Hi." The fence glittered at him.
He grinned.
His mother, holding a candle in a jar, did not see what he saw and tugged his hand away. "Later," she said the most adult word. Mara reached into her tote and took out the padded envelope without thinking about what kind of person that made her. She unsealed it and drew the ruined plate into the streetlight that wasn't, and the dark that was. She held it up to the fence and waited. At once, the glitter gathered along the edges of the glass the way iron filings flock to a magnet. They lined the gouges with starlight. They turned the bubbles into coins. And then, very gently, the plate agreed to become a room again. A desk, a chair, a lamp that had filed its memory. The man with the scar. He did not look up this time. He lifted the bracelet again. He held it the way you hold something you've decided to break if necessary. "What are you?" Mara asked, and did not mean the man. The light on the fence, the light in the plate, the light in the air, the residual city light that had no source, All the light that remained after it answered by doing what it loved most, telling. It told without grammar. It told with edges and patience. It told with the relief of being allowed to speak after a long era of reflection. It told the last 30 seconds of 100 rooms in 100 buildings across the city, where lamps had gone out and people had said words they thought nobody would keep. Mara heard a grandmother say, "I won't be sad if you move away, I'll be sad if you lie." She heard a bartender whisper to a photograph, "I'll stop tomorrow," and mean it. She heard a teenager say, bravely, "No," and then quietly, "No." She heard her own voice from an afternoon 3 years earlier say, "Then we're done," and the silence that followed and the sound of a door closing gently because the door did not deserve anger. She heard the man at the desk say, "Until morning." Ivo exhaled so hard the candles across the street shivered. "Okay," he said raggedly. "So we're eavesdropping on the persistence of illumination." He laughed, a small, astonished sound. "The city is recording? Or rehearsing? Or refusing to let go?" "Historians would call it retention," Mara said, "because when you are frightened you reach for taxonomy. Or afterimage." She wanted to reach into the plate and pluck the bracelet out like a splinter. She wanted to hurl it into the dark and watch the dark learn hunger. Somewhere north, a new sound began, 100 people gasping at once. The pins on Ivo's map writhed, then drew a new shape, not a diamond, but an eye. The point of the eye sat directly over the Hall of Records. "We should go," Mara said. They ran, because running felt like a thesis. The city ran with them in its own way, shadows moving a second before the bodies that cast them, windows looking at them without light to look with, a traffic light that had been dark all night deciding to blink green once like a benediction and then return to its vast. In the stairwell, the emergency lights hummed, and the hum sounded like consonants. In the reading room, the plate on the desk had been joined by 3 more. She had not taken 3 more. And yet here they were, each on its paper sleeve, each glowing with the delicate restraint of a thing that does not want to scare you, but cannot help being itself. The window was cool and black. The afterglow in the room came from the plates alone. Ivo made a noise like a person trying not to make a noise and failed. "Is this normal archivist behavior?" "No," Mara said. "This is theft from the future." On the nearest plate, a hotel room assembled. A double bed, a crooked painting of a ship, a suitcase cracked like an egg. In the bed, a woman slept on her back with her mouth slightly open and her hand on her chest, as if reminding her heart of its job. On another plate, a bar top appeared, glass rings layered like tree rings, a newspaper headline about a council vote that never passed because nobody showed. On the third plate was a skylight with grime in the corners and a spider with scholarly patience. The plates did not show everything. They showed lasts, the last breath before waking, the last sip before a promise, the last warm beam of a day before night argued it away. The room felt crowded with endings that were still politely queuing. Mara touched the edge of the hotel plate with the back of her fingernail. The air above it cooled, as if the plate contained its own breeze. "Why us?" she said. "Why this room?" The answer arrived without sound, because you keep. Not a voice. A certainty, like the feeling of the right key finding the right lock. Ivo leaned over the skylight plate. "If this gets any weirder, we'll need terminology. May I name things?" He looked at her, genuinely asking. It disarmed her, that courtesy. "You may suggest," she said. He pointed at the hotel plate. "This is a holdover." Light holding over from itself to finish a thought.
He pointed at the bar.
"This is a loop. A repetition because it doesn't believe us yet." He tapped the skylight, careful not to touch. His finger's shadow skimmed the glass like a skater. "This is a sieve. Light catching language like rain catches dust." "Archivist," said the not voice. Or perhaps it was the room learning to imitate one. Mara felt the word on her skin. Not Mara.
"Archivist."
She swallowed. "Yes." "File," said the light. Or the window. Or the plate. Or the building, which had always wanted to be helpful and had finally been offered a job it liked. "File what?" Ivo asked too brightly. The lights above the exit flickered. 1, 2, in a rhythm that was not Morse but pretended to be because it understood that humans trust alphabets. Mara stepped closer to the desk. The plate with the hotel room flared. In the bed, the woman woke, turned her head, and spoke into the dark. "I forgive you," she said, to someone not there. The afterlight liked that sentence. It gilded it, it kept it. The woman's eyes closed again. The sentence hung in the air a heartbeat longer than sentences can. Then it drifted toward the plate and was filed with the patience of a river. A breath touched Mara's ear. No air moved. No person stood behind her. Still, she felt that intimate pressure, someone leaning in not to frighten but to be sure. A shape developed in the window. Not a figure, not yet a catalogue. The thick shadow of shelves, a ladder, a desk with a blotter, a pen that wrote light onto light. The desk had been there for a very long time, in the place beyond, in the corridor of illumination. Someone sat at it. Someone whose outline was the absence of light shaped like a person. Ivo saw it, too. His hand found Mara's sleeve and held the fabric with the respect due a person and their jacket. "Is that the archivist?" Mara said softly, and did not mean herself. The shape lifted its head as if hearing its name from an unexpected quarter. It did not have a face the way faces have faces. It had a readiness. It turned toward them, toward the window, toward the room, toward the plates, and raised a hand that was not a hand but a binding. A book's worth of gesture. Mara, who had lived her life inside stacks and drawers and boxes and the persistent, inconvenient ethics of memory, felt the shape's attention land on her like a coat properly fitted. Not a threat. A function. She lifted her chin and said, "You have the wrong building." A pause, full of careful footnotes. Then no. Correct building. Correct person.
Why?
Mara asked. "Because you keep the certainty," said again. "Because you understand custody." "So do a lot of people," she said.
Teachers.
"Parents." "Yes," said the certainty, in a tone that meant, "and yet. You will know how to remain when remaining is removal. Those are opposites." "So are doors and walls," the certainty answered patiently. "And yet both are architecture." The plates went briefly emerald, the way old monitors did when powered down too quickly. Ivo made a librarian noise, a hiss of admiration. The shape at the window smiled.
No.
But some arrangement of its readiness suggested amusement. "Okay," he said, because someone needed to say a human word. "What is the task?" "Because every briefing needs a task." The room dimmed. The plates gentled. The window showed only its own city again. The emergency lights hummed an F. Mara's phone buzzed weakly back to life, as if remembering it had a spine. A message arrived from a number she had not seen in years. "Are you seeing this?" No name. Her chest did a small, traitorous dance. She silenced the phone and placed it face down on the desk. Choices were shelves. Some you label immediately. Some you wait until the contents complain. The task arrived as a feeling. It settled on her sternum with the weight of a hand. Not instruction, not command. Invitation. "There is too much keeping," it said without words. "Too many stories that will not go. The city will drown in its own afterlight. We require a curator to decide which remains and which releases. We require a burn that is merciful." "You want me to," Mara began, and then finished only in her mind because to say it aloud would make it irrevocable. "To unkeep." Ivo's grip on her sleeve tightened, not possessive but anchoring. "We don't know enough yet," he said, which was both cowardice and courage. "We need a map." The pins on his phone shifted and rearranged and, for one impossible second, drew a shape Mara recognized, a bracelet made of storm thread, looping the city. A draft stirred. The lamp that wasn't there flickered. The afterlight, polite and patient, dimmed as if bowing. Far below, somewhere in the velvet streets, a generator coughed awake, and a building blinked on. And then, in protest, off again. The city chuckled. The night continued being a day that had decided to whisper. The window held only night. The plates lay quiet on their sleeves. The archivist in the beyond made a note in a ledger you could not burn. Mara let go of her breath. "All right," she said into the room that had been waiting for her sentence. "I'll keep what must be kept. I'll let go what must be let go." The air answered like a cat's blink. "And I'll need help." She did not look at Ivo. She did not need to. "Great," he said, with relief and terror in equal measure. "I have several wrong ideas to start with." By the time they stepped back into the stairwell, the emergency lights had softened as if pleased. The city was humming, and the hum had acquired a harmony. Behind them, on the desk, the plate with the hotel room brightened for 2 seconds and then settled. In that brief flare, if anyone had been watching with the proper patience, they would have seen the sleeping woman smile in her sleep at something not the present. Then the light that remained after it did what it had not yet learned could be done. It went dark of its own accord. Outside, somewhere, the violin started again, soft, brave, a line drawn straight through the dark without apology. The city was not sleeping anymore. It was remembering loudly. Every street lamp, every reflection, every polished surface hummed with the burden of memory. The air had turned faintly luminescent, as though even oxygen wanted to preserve a record of its passing. Mara stood in the plaza before City Hall, a candle in her hand. Around her, hundreds of citizens had gathered, each holding something that could glow: candles, phones, jars, bulbs, screens. Together they made a wavering constellation, an imitation of stars built by a city desperate to outshine its own ghosts. Above them, the paper sun, the skylight of City Hall, pulsed with letters made of gold dust. The words unspooled into the night sky. Too much kept. Not enough released. Ivo stood beside her, his hair wild from the heat rising from the crowd. "It's asking you," he murmured. "You're the archivist now. You have to decide what burns." Sarah Voss arrived carrying a glass sphere the size of her head, filled with trembling light. "This is everything I've collected," she said softly. "All the voices trapped in the lenses. All the small stories that begged to stay. They want out." Mara looked into the sphere. Within it flickered moments, snippets of lives, whispers of forgiveness, regrets, small kindnesses, all compressed into radiance. It was unbearably beautiful and impossibly heavy. The archivist of Afterlight appeared behind the paper sun, visible now to everyone as a figure made of script and glow, its face a mosaic of all the stories ever told in light. It didn't speak, it waited. Its patience was the kind that had outlived civilizations. Mara turned to Ivo. "If I keep everything, we drown in memory. If I burn it, we lose what made us human." Ivo reached for her hand. "Then find the third way." She closed her eyes. The crowd murmured, restless. She thought of her mother's ghost in the window, of the bracelet, the glass plates, the sleeping woman whispering forgiveness, of the quiet, merciful dark that follows every bright moment. Then she understood. She lifted the candle and said clearly, "We don't have to forget. We only have to forgive." She touched the flame to the glass sphere. It didn't shatter. It bloomed. The light poured upward, slow and tender. Not destruction, but release. Every lamp, every window, every phone screen opened like a flower. The light lifted from the city, not erased, but free, rising into the clouds like pollen returning to its source. The archivist bowed once, solemn and graceful. Its glow folded inward until it became no brighter than a firefly. Then it vanished, leaving only the faint scent of paper and ozone. The crowd fell silent. Above them, the sky was darker than it had been in generations, and filled with real stars. No afterlight, no residue, just clean dark and honest brilliance. Ivo exhaled. "You didn't burn the stories. You let them keep themselves." Mara smiled, small and tired. "The light that remains after it isn't ours to keep. We're only supposed to carry it long enough to pass it on." As dawn broke, the first true sunlight in weeks touched the glass towers of the city. It was thin, pure, unrecorded. The streets shimmered not with memory, but with dew. Mara placed the stub of her candle on the ground and walked toward the Hall of Records. Behind her, the crowd began to hum. Soft, human, unarchived. In the archives, the glass plates had gone transparent. The shelves hummed once and went still. On her desk lay the last thing that glowed, a faint outline of a bracelet made of storm thread. It pulsed once, like a heartbeat, then faded. Mara whispered to the empty room, "Thank you for remembering." And from nowhere and everywhere came a quiet answer, "Now live." Epilogue: The Bloom. Weeks later, the city glowed again, but this time from flowers. In every window box, on every street median, pale blossoms had appeared, phosphorescent at dusk.
No one had planted them.
They opened at night, released faint light, and whispered tiny sounds, snatches of laughter, fragments of lullabies, the rustle of pages turned. The city called them afterblooms.
People walked slower now.
They looked at one another. The sky stayed dark and clean. In the Hall of Records, Mara tended a single bloom in a glass jar on her desk. When it opened, it said, softly, "Good night, archivist." And she smiled, switched off the lamp, and let the light that remained after it tell its stories to the dark.